Hey there, in this video I want to go over just basic constraints and how we use them for animation. Constraints are a great way to connect objects to other objects, have characters pick up and hold them, wear them. For example, like the hat attached to the character's head, brick in this guy's hand, the hand on hip. So to find the list of constraints, you have to be under the animation tab here, and you can go under constraint. I'll tear it off, and you can see that there's a list of a number of constraints that are possible. I'll just highlight quickly which ones we use kind of on a more regular basis for animation. So point constraints, orients, and parent constraints. And I'll show you the aim constraint because that's just sort of fun, but that's more of a rigging one. There are other constraints on this list that are also very useful, but we'll cover those at another time. So first we'll look at a point constraint. And the way you set up constraints, you first pick the master and then shift pick the object you want to follow it. Now when I hit point, the sphere goes right directly to the object that's constrained to. So now when I translate the cube around, the sphere follows. And you can see over in the channel box, the sphere's translation channels are a light blue. That means it's being driven by that cube. And if we look at the hypergraph, you'll notice that there's an extra node that was attached underneath the sphere, and it's got an exclamation point. That is an indicator that that is a constraint. And it's also a way that you can break the constraint. You can just select it and delete it. So what if we wanted to set up this constraint, but we didn't want it to go directly to the pivot of that other one? This is where we might change the way we do our constraint. So there's an option when we set up a constraint to maintain that position. So if we do our point constraint again, and this time turn on maintain offset, we'll pick the master, shift select the sphere, and hit apply. You'll see that it is constrained, the channel's taken up, but it preserved its position. Either way is viable, it just depends on how you're using the constraint. So let's take a look at the orient constraint. Now if we pick the master here, shift select the follower, orient, you'll see that the rotation channels are now taken up, and when we rotate the box around, the sphere follows. So we also have the same concept of maintaining offset here. So let's put a rotation on this object and then redo it again. But this time we'll put on maintain offset, hit apply, and now that still has a 45-degree angle to it, but it's still constrained. And if we take a look at the parent constraint now, it has the exact same options as the others in terms of maintaining offset. And you'll notice that when we hit apply this one, it takes the translation and rotation channels. So you get both kind of a point and an orient constraint in one shot. So something to note about the parent constraint is that when we do rotations on it, the object following is actually going to rotate around the master's pivot point and not its individual pivot point. And lastly, we'll look at the aim constraint. Usually it's for rigging to set up eye controls. So that's why I have this little eyeball here. And in this case, I'm using a locator. Locators are really light, they don't render, and this will be something I tend to use for most of my constraint setups. So if we pick the locator, shift pick the eyeball, and then do our aim, when we translate the locator around, you'll see that the eyeball follows. So what it's doing is it's driving the rotation channels. And it drives it both ways. If we grab the eyeball and translate it, it's always going to keep that orientation aiming at that locator. So now let's apply this to a character. We want this hat to follow underneath the head control. So to connect the hat to the head, we'll use a parent constraint. So first pick the head control, shift pick the hat, and under the option box we'll leave maintain offset off for a second and hit apply, and you'll see that it'll pop to the kind of the center of the head. So again, that's not what we want. So we'll undo that and we'll turn on maintain offset, hit apply, and then it's now constrained. It's taking up the translation and rotation channels, and it's going to follow the head and keep that initial pose. And let's jump down and go to an object in the character's hand. So if I want to connect that brick to the character's hand, I will pick the hand control, shift pick the brick. Again, I'll keep maintain offset on and hit apply, and now that brick will follow. So another good use of constraints is if I want to put this hand on the hip. Now I did switch this over to IK so that we get the IK solution automatically. FK is not going to be useful in this example. So if we pick the hip control, shift pick the IK handle, and again we can use parent constraint for that, hit apply, and when we translate the body now, that hand will go with it, and if we rotate the hip, the hand will be locked down to that perfectly as well. And really quick, here's our little example of the aim constraint applied to the eyes. So that's going to be it for a basic intro of constraints. I hope you guys have fun animating.